In this lesson, we are going to talk about API versioning, and I'll start by explaining what API versioning is. In simple terms, API versioning is the process of managing and tracking changes to your API. This also involves communicating changes about your API to your API consumers, and if there's one constant with API development is that you can't avoid changes to your API. Broadly speaking, there are three types of API versioning. Query parameter versioning, where you specify the API version as a query parameter in your URL. Header API versioning, where you pass the API version using a custom request header. And URL versioning, where the API version is part of the actual route. URL versioning is also the most popular approach to API versioning, and it's what I'm going to implement in this lesson. But when should you version your API? The convention that I like to follow is that you should version the API as soon as you make a breaking change. What constitutes a breaking change should be an agreement that you make as a team, but here are a few examples. Any changes to the behavior of your API constitutes a breaking change. Adding or removing API endpoints is a breaking change. Changing the request parameters without default values or adding or removing fields to the API response could also be a breaking change. Some of these API changes will break your API consumers, and they are definitely dangerous. On the other hand, some teams wouldn't consider adding a response field as a breaking change. And this is why I said that you should agree upon a standard as a team and then stick to that when it comes to API versioning. And now let's see how we're going to implement API versioning in the clean architecture. I'm going to start by adding a NuGet package to the infrastructure project, and let's look for API versioning. Now you might be tempted to reach for the Microsoft package that supports versioning, but if you take a closer look, you will see that this package is deprecated, and it says that you should use the ASP versioning MVC package. And this is the package that you should install if you want to use controllers. If you want to use minimal APIs, you should use the ASP versioning HTTP package. So let's go ahead and install the ASP versioning MVC because I'm using controllers. I'll add my versioning code in my dependency injection class, and I'll start by creating a new method to add my API versioning services. So I'll call this method add API versioning, and it's going to have one argument that will be the service collection. Let me add the required code inside this method. I need to call the add API versioning method to configure my API versioning options object, and I also need to chain a call to add MVC because I am using controllers. Now let's take a look at the API versioning options and the properties that I'm configuring on this object. First, I'm setting the default API version to be version 1. This is a sensible default value if you are just introducing API versioning to your solution. Then I have this flag, which is called report API versioning. And what this will do is attach an HTTP header called API supported versions that's going to return the API versions supported by the current endpoint. It's also going to add the API deprecated versions response header reporting the deprecated API versions. And then the next important property that I'm setting is the API version reader. And this actually determines what kind of API versioning I want to be using. I'm passing in a URL segment API version reader because I want to implement URL versioning. If I wanted to implement header API versioning, I would pass in a header API version reader and say what is the header name that will contain the API version. For example, this could be X version ID. Alternatively, if you wanted to use query parameter versioning, you would use the query string API version reader. Now, the API version reader also allows you to support multiple types of API versioning by calling API version reader combine. And you can pass in multiple API version reader instances. So let's say we pass in the header API version reader and the URL segment version reader. This is how we could support both types of API versioning in our solution. Now I'm going to revert this to just the URL segment API version reader, and let's see how we would implement this on our controller. I'm going to head over to the user's controller, and let's introduce support for API versioning on this controller. Because I want to use URL versioning, I need to update my controller route. So I'm going to add a v here. This is going to represent my version, and then a route parameter. And this will be called version, and the type will be API version. And this allows me to specify my API routes using v1 or v2. Another thing that I can configure is the API version using the API version attribute. And this allows me to configure the supported versions on this controller Let's say I want to support version 1 and version 2. This practically means that I will have two versions of each endpoint. Hard coding your API versions like this could be error prone, so I like to use a similar approach to what I did with the roles and permissions, and I will create a static class called API versions. So let's define version 1 and also version 2. I like to use strings, but you can also use numbers here. And the usage would look like API versions and then v1. And in the second attribute, we can specify version 2. Now, if you want to deprecate a particular API version, you can set the deprecated flag to true. And this would make all version 1 endpoints deprecated and version 2 would be the active version. So let's revert this. And what I'm going to do is to create a copy of my get logged in user endpoint, and I want to map these to different API versions. So let's say the first one is version 1 and the second one will be version 2. Now you need to explicitly map this to an API version. So I'm going to say map to API versions v1, and for the second endpoint we're going to map it to version 2. The functionality between these two endpoints is the same. I just want to use them as an example. And of course I need to call my add API versioning method to configure the actual services inside of my call to the add infrastructure method. And let's start the API and check out how API versioning works. What I'm going to do is call the get endpoint to return the details for the logged in user, and I'm going to target the version 1 endpoint. So let's send this request, and you can see that we hit the breakpoint inside of the version 1 endpoint as expected because I explicitly mapped it to version 1. So if I hit continue, we're going to get the response back. If I call the version 2 endpoint instead and hit send, we will hit the respective breakpoint in the version 2 endpoint, which is going to return the same result. And if I try to hit an unsupported version like version 3, we will get a 404 not found response because such a version doesn't exist. Let me also show you what happens when I call an existing version such as version 1. And if we take a look at the headers in our response, you can see the API supported versions header with the supported versions being 1 and 2. This is how you can tell your API consumer which API versions are supported. Let's go over to the Swagger UI for a moment. Unfortunately, you will see that we get an internal server error in the Swagger UI. This is because there are two endpoints with the same route and Swagger doesn't know how to differentiate between our different API versions. So let's go ahead and fix this. To be able to support multiple API versions and make them work with Swagger, we need to install one more NuGet package in the infrastructure project, and this is the ASP Versioning MVC API Explorer package. So let's go ahead and install it. Now I need to head over to the dependency injection section and introduce one more method call. We're going to call the add API Explorer method, which allows us to configure the API Explorer options, and I'm going to set the group name format property for my URL versions. First I have the lowercase v, which matches this one here in my user's controller route, and then there is the uppercase v, which is just a wildcard matching my actual API version. The second property that I'm setting is substitute API versions in URL. If we start the API now and navigate to our Swagger UI, you'll see that the Swagger user interface is working as before, and our user's endpoints have the API versions explicitly specified in the route. However, the version 2 endpoints are nowhere to be found. And the reason that you can see version 1 here is because we configured the substitute API version in URL as true, which is going to use the default API version in the Swagger routes. We need to make a few more updates to make this work correctly with Swagger. So I'm going to add a new folder in my API project and I will call it OpenAPI. Inside of it, I'm going to add a class that I will call configure Swagger options. So this class will implement the iConfigure named options interface. So let me specify this interface, and it's going to configure the Swagger gen options class. Let's implement the missing members. In the configure method that has a name argument, we're just going to call the other implementation of the configure method. Now we need to inject a dependency in this class, and this dependency is the iAPI version description provider. This will allow us to access the API version descriptions property and add each API version to the Swagger document, and what's remaining is to add the implementation for the create version info method. This is going to be a private static method that's going to take in the API version description and it's going to create an OpenAPI info object and return it as an argument for the Swagger doc method. Now we also need to run this configure options from our program CS file. So let's add that here. I'll say builder services configure options, and then we can pass in configure Swagger options, which is the class that we just implemented. The second thing we need to do is to update the call to add Swagger UI to this implementation. We're going to pass in a delegate for the Swagger UI options so that we can call some method on this class. And I'm using the web application here to call the describe API version method, which is going to return a collection of API version descriptions. Then I'm going to iterate over this collection and create the URL for my API version and the API version name, and I'm going to call the Swagger endpoint method to configure the path to the respective Swagger JSON document. So let's start the API now and see how these changes reflect on the Swagger user interface. Here's the Swagger UI again, and at first sight it looks like not much has changed. We still have our API endpoints and then the version 1 endpoints. However, if you take a look at the dropdown here, you will see that we have version 1 and version 2. If I navigate to version 2, you can see my version 2 endpoints that are configured in the user's controller. And if I go back to version 1, it will be the remaining API endpoints and the version 1 endpoints in the user's controller. Let's go back to the code and finish up the API versioning implementation. I'll start with the user's controller by removing API version 2. Then I'll remove the version 2 endpoint. And in my version 1 endpoint, I'm just going to revert to the old behavior. And now I'm going to add API versioning to the other controllers that we have. So here is the review controller. Let's add the required changes. I'm adding the API version as part of the route. I'm going to do the same for my bookings, and I'll do the same in the apartments controller. So now all of my controllers support API versioning. And you can see how easy this is to configure once you implement the initial setup, which is really simplified thanks to the abstractions introduced by the versioning libraries. In this lesson, we only tackled versioning your controllers, and I'm also going to show you how to version minimal APIs in one of the next lessons where I'll be talking about minimal APIs in depth.